Our Constitution clearly defines roles for the branches of government. Congress writes the laws and appropriates funding. The President and agencies faithfully execute those laws using the resources that Congress provides. America is in a bit of a struggle right now over whether the job of the executive branch is to faithfully implement the laws that have been adopted by the people's representatives, or whether it is to serve the personal whims and the political demands of the president. From the beginning of his time in office, the last president made clear his desire to strip the federal workforce of experts and replace them with loyalists. Right out of the gate, President Trump proposed cutting 20% of funding from the National Institutes of Health in my district, the institution that has saved the lives of thousands and thousands of Americans through research into diseases like cancer, diabetes, asthma, cystic fibrosis, multiple sclerosis, and so on. As his administration continued, Trump continued to undermine a professional, expert, nonpartisan federal workforce and to undermine scientific and policy expertise. At various points throughout his term, he asserted that Americans should inject themselves with disinfectant as a cure for the coronavirus, that the noise from windmills causes cancer, and that you need an ID to buy a box of cereal. The former president elevated political loyalty above professional expertise in the workforce, and he made no effort to conceal his desire to remove any official who dared to disagree with his particular positions. We saw that in the firing of Chris Krebs, the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, for daring to say that, quote, there is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was any way compromised in the 2020 election. In his zeal to rid the government of anyone who might dare to contradict him, Trump took drastic action to convert the traditional nonpartisan federal workforce into an army of partisan loyalists. He did this by creating a new category of federal workers called Schedule F, for which civil service protections would not apply. Schedule F would make it possible for the president to fire any federal worker who disagreed with his particular spin on policies or who dared to tell the truth about public safety, public health, science, or the law. And it doesn't take much imagination to picture how this policy could transform our government into what one former Republican political appointee called, quote, an army of suck-ups. Because this is how our government used to work. Before the Civil Service Act of 1883, the Pendleton Act, federal jobs were basically at the control of political bosses and were for sale to the highest bidder. And now there is an effort to revive this system. Thankfully, during his first week in office, President Biden revoked the Schedule F executive order, and OPM recently finalized a rule to strengthen our workforce and ensure that it remains expert and nonpartisan. But the former president has been explicit about his plans to revive Schedule F and to strip the workforce of its nonpartisan protections very aggressively should he return to office. Well, what would government be like if we moved in the direction of this assault on the professional civil service? Well, here's the example I like to think of. In 2019, the then president declared that despite all the evidence to the contrary from the scientific experts at the National Weather Service in NOAA, Hurricane Dorian, he said, was going to hit the state of Alabama. Now, all the meteorologists said that was wrong. It was not going to hit Alabama. It was going to hit Florida's Atlantic coast, which it did, wreaking devastation across the state. The experts at the Weather Service had to scramble to try to undo the misinformation that had been spread by the president. But what if they had not been able to do that? What if they feared that speaking up about where the hurricane was really going to land would cost them their jobs? What if they stayed silent and allowed the dispatch of hundreds of emergency personnel to the wrong states, leaving communities to drown without essential help and services? Well, the former president promptly instructed his team to track down the scientists who corrected his predictions by Sharpie. According to a 2020 report by the Office of Inspector General at Commerce, Trump's Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, wrote an email to Commerce Department officials stating, "As it currently stands, it appears as if the National Weather Service intentionally contradicted the president, and we need to know why." And then they demanded a correction or an explanation. And NOAA's leadership under Trump went so far as to rebuke the National Weather Service's Birmingham, Alabama office for tweeting accurate, life-saving hurricane prediction information simply because it contradicted what the president had to say. Now, no one got fired because the old protections were in place, the very protections that Trump pledges to destroy if he's elected again. Is that the government we want? Do we want the reign of folly over science and whim over professional expertise, or big money over the public interest? I'm sure everyone saw the former president's meeting with oil and gas executives where he asked them to raise $1 billion and then pledged he would issue a series of regulations undoing all of the climate progress that has been made in the Biden administration. Look, our Constitution put in place a series of checks and balances, and we elect a president to faithfully execute the laws. That's the job of the president. That's the job of the executive branch, not to rewrite the laws, not to distort the laws, not to mangle the laws, and not to override the laws with a Sharpie. And so we must preserve those safeguards, and I'll be interested to hear from our witness about what he will do to make sure that those safeguards are kept in place. With that, I will yield to Mr. Connolly for his, I suppose, 5 or 6 minutes, depending on the chairman's grace. Thank you.
I thank the ranking member and thank the chair. Welcome, Mr. Shriver, to your first experience with the United States Congress. Just be grateful you weren't here the other night. And I do want to begin by noting for my friend from Texas, Mr. Sessions, it's not a deep state bureaucracy that thwarted, for example, the ill-advised plan to abolish your agency and to fold it into GSA. I worked with a Republican named Mark Meadows to make sure that was killed. That was members of Congress working on that. And as the ranking member just indicated, it's going to be members of Congress working on Schedule F as well, not a deep state thwarting of the presidential will, whether it be President Trump or President Biden or some future president. This hearing ought to be an opportunity to explore ways we can agree in a bipartisan manner to continue to invest in and improve our federal workforce and to deliver more efficient and effective services for the American people. After all, OPM is the human resources agency of the federal government. We ought to be finding ways to close the 22.47% income gap between private sector and public sector employees, such as by passing the FAIR Act, which I've introduced with many co-sponsors, which would provide federal employees with a 7.4% increase in 2025, and by following up on the Biden administration's historic decision to establish a $15 per hour minimum pay raise for federal employees. We ought to be strengthening and reforming OPM itself to maintain the agency as a preeminent independent HR and personnel policy manager for the entire federal government, such as through the Office of Personnel Management Reform Act, which would codify essential recommendations included in the National Academy of Public Administration's congressionally directed report from March of 2021. And we ought to be expanding benefits that help recruit younger, talented employees, such as requiring the Federal Employee Health Benefit Program to cover in vitro fertilization and other assisted reproductive technology, ART, a mandate we could establish today by enacting the Family Building FEHBP Fairness Act. 4 years ago, President Trump signed Executive Order 13957, creating a new schedule for the civil service, Schedule F. This executive order intended to undermine the merit system principles of our federal workforce by requiring agency heads to reclassify, quote, policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating, unquote, positions to a newly created Schedule F category of federal employees and remove federal workers' due process rights and civil service protections. The real purpose of the executive order was to provide the former president with the ability to dismiss at start at least 50,000 dedicated civil servants and replace them with political appointees as sycophants. In turn, the previous administration intended to turn our skilled nonpartisan civil service into an army of ill-prepared and unqualified loyalists. That's the risk. We haven't done that since the Pendleton Act of 1883. Returning to the spoils system is a bad idea for America. In response, I introduced a bipartisan bill, the Saving the Civil Service Act, which would require any president who must seek the approval of Congress before significantly expanding the accepted service in the civil service, and in doing so, depriving huge classes of existing federal employees of their civil service protections. This legislation would preserve our merit-based civil service system, which is necessary to guarantee continuity through changing administrations, preserve institutional knowledge and expertise within the federal government, and protect the rule of law. I also made sure to reintroduce this bill in this Congress, which currently has 36 co-sponsors, including a number of Republicans. While I'm grateful that the latest OPM rule to reinforce and clarify protections for nonpartisan career civil service is a great first step, the civil service will not be protected from reclassification unless it's codified into law. An executive order can be overturned. I call on all stakeholders to support the Saving the Civil Service Act and push for its passage so that it is certain that no future president, irrespective of party, can, with the stroke of a pen, fire tens of thousands of federal employees who are currently protected under the law. While we fight this existential threat, I remain committed to helping OPM find ways to ensure that we have a federal workforce our nation needs to meet current and future challenges and that best serve our constituents, the American people. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Robert Shriver serves as Acting Director of the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, the federal government's chief human capital agency. Mr. Shriver was appointed as the agency's Deputy Director in December 2022 and previously served in several roles within OPM during the Obama administration. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witness will please stand and raise his right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record...
What is the value of having independent scientific experts working for us? And two, does that mean that the president cannot, in fact, faithfully execute the laws according to his own interpretation? In other words, is there a necessary conflict between political appointees like you and the scientists and experts who populate most of the federal government?
I think it's critical for the American people to have trust and confidence that decisions and information and data that's being presented is being done so by experts in the field, and that especially when you're talking about risk to life and risk to property, that we make sure that the American public understands that the information they're receiving comes from the experts. And I don't see any conflict whatsoever, Congressman, with that really important public interest and being able for political appointees to work with career employees on the president's priorities.
Well, I appreciate that, and I hope that there's not a conflict and that we'll be able to continue to have political leadership working together with an independent and expert civil service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back to you.
Chair recognizes the chairman of the Government Operations Subcommittee, Mr. Sessions from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I hope that the gentleman, Mr. Shriver, sees that, as I spoke to you yesterday, on both sides of this committee, Republican and Democrat, you would be offered and asked what I consider to be professional questions that are important to the legislative responsibility that we have. And I appreciate the distinguished gentleman from Maryland and Kentucky and my other members for attempting to follow the same norm. I think it's important that the American people also see that we make this about them and not about either one of our parties. Mr. Shriver, there are two overwhelming questions that I would like to engage in right now, and one is the term qualified versus diversity, hiring on diversity. You've heard conversations, I'm sure, out of this committee and in the press, I'm sure in your administration, about hiring qualified employees as opposed to adding a diverse workforce. Could you please tell me the OPM decision structure on this issue?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. We support the President's initiative on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, that we are implementing that initiative consistent with the merit system principles, which require fair and equitable treatment without regard to
All right, sir,
race or
thank you
other
very much.
characteristics.
Well, I'm talking about the hiring procedures. So under this term that we just used, diversity, does a person have to be qualified and fit the same parameters and recommendations that it would for any employee being hired?
100%, sir. That is part of the merit system principles.
So what you're attempting to do is to upgrade the number of people, I get this, across our country to give everyone a fair and equitable chance, so to speak, at getting a job. And you're simply highlighting the need where numbers do not reflect that. Would that be appropriate way to say this?
Right. So we look for barriers, and so one barrier, for example, Congressman, is the lack of paid internships in the federal government. That's a barrier to people seeking federal employment. So we issued guidance early in the administration to require more paid internships, as an
Do
example.
you think that also helps people to against people who do not have those opportunities for an internship? Is it simply a check that's given them that you will now give them a higher threshold for entrance?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite following your
Do
question.
you use that as a measure then to determine, to give them, like a veteran, an extra plus because they have completed it, so you use that as a measure?
Thank you for the clarification. So any time spent working in a federal job can help you qualify for your next federal job.
Thank you very much. Director, I would like to move now to the question of the government inventing new processes, procedures to compete against the free enterprise system, about what already exists, and the government developing these rather than seeking opportunities. We've talked about D18, which was an organization that was brought in under President Obama that we believe, after a hearing on both sides, that they did not perform the duties that they said they did. It caused great consternation to .gov with deception. I would also bring up other agencies that go and compete. For instance, Jobs USA. Meanwhile, there are numerous pre-enterprise system people that have a broader grasp of people to find government jobs, whether it be in Waco, Texas, or whether it be in New York City, that they are already established. And I find that this government is going and spending taxpayer money to embellish their systems to go and hire more people. What are you finding? Are you finding that they just get this money and go do that? Or is OPM saying, let's not recreate a marketplace answer that's already there? What would the OPM answer be as your direction to agencies?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. So with respect to USA Jobs, that's been something that OPM has run now for, I think, some 15 years. One of the key design features of USA Jobs was, we called it a universal trailer hitch, which basically the idea is that any staffing system could plug into USA Jobs. And so agencies could use whatever staffing system they wanted from the private sector.
Without regard for OPM trying to direct those agencies about a preference or a way to use. So would you consider, if OPM went to an agency and said, we're trying to stay leading edge, but let's not do something that might be a competitive edge or against another provider that's already out there, you're saying that would not be tolerated?
I think it's very important that we maintain a level playing field for all of these staffing systems, as long as they meet the requirements, which are like cybersecurity requirements and such, and an agency wants to use them, then they should be able to use them.
But I'm talking about the agency giving preference to their own development and their own product.
So again, I think it's really important that we maintain a level playing field. So when we are offering a product that, as an agency, that also the private sector is offering, a staffing system is the primary
Okay, let me go
example.
back on this.
Okay.
Would you use your competitive insight to offer to a federal agency that they should use you and not someone else, a preference? Would
No.
that be permissible under your rules and regulations from OPM for you to direct or to solicit something against another competitor in the marketplace?
No, my clear direction is that we maintain a level playing field for private sector vendors.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time. And to the ranking member, I think that this is a great hearing, and I appreciate both of you for professionally moving this forward. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Norton from Washington, D.C.
I don't have any questions.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Mfume from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, excuse me, and the ranking member. And it's good to have the remarks also from the gentleman from Texas. He serves as the chair, and I'm the ranking member, as many of you know, on the subcommittee of oversight. Day in and day out, 2.2 million civil servants that are employed in the federal workforce keep our government operating. To preserve and protect our federal workforce, many of us believe, Mr. Shriver, that Congress should focus more on legislative action that supports efforts to recruit and retain top talent and focus less on chasing away high-quality employees into the private sector. I do want to say on the record you've done an excellent job of keeping me and many members of the committee apprised of all the hard work that OPM is doing to protect the federal workforce from political maneuvering, which is so extremely important. I also applaud OPM's finalization of the Upholding Civil Service Protections and Merit Systems Principle rules, which implement protections that, as we know, would make it difficult for future administrations to reapply what is known as the Trump policy at Schedule F, which sought to convert tens of thousands of federal employees to at-will workers. Several of my colleagues and I fought together to give this policy the sort of treatment that it deserves and to give the federal workforce reassurance that they will never have their employment in jeopardy because of political manipulation. The last thing that any of us want to do, I believe, is to force agencies to adopt policies that bow to the politics that hamstring their mission, regardless of what party might be in control. I also want to highlight that one of those flexibilities that attacked and retrain high-quality employees is telework, which sometimes is a bad word in this body. I think that we've got to support telework and remote work arrangements at certain agencies as long as it does not hamper the delivery of service to our constituents. I do want to ask you, Mr. Shriver, if you could take a minute to paint a picture for us of what our federal workforce would look like if Schedule F prevailed under this administration or any other administration, and to talk about what you may see as the hindrance of political loyalists over policy experts and why that is a threat to what we'd like to believe is creation and protection of the best workforce possible.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think what's really critical for the American people is that they have confidence that the career civil servants are offering their expert advice and they're offering their expert opinions. And I think a system that transforms large portions of the federal workforce into a world where they don't have for-cause protections, I think that it puts that important principle at risk. When Congress enacted the Civil Service Reform Act, there were several value judgments in that law, right? And one of those value judgments were that we want to make sure that federal employees aren't chilled for speaking out to offer their expert advice or identify problems that they see. As a leader of an agency, that is critical to me. I need our career workforce to feel confident that they can give me the best information and the best advice they have.
And what would you describe as the immediate and long-term effect on both recruitment and retention if Schedule F, as we know it, were to be effective?
I think that if we were to send a message to the public that you no longer are prioritized in the federal government based on the skills, abilities, knowledge that you have, but instead that you're going to be valued based on some other non-merit factor, I think that the human capital challenges that the federal government already faces would be dramatically exacerbated.
Well, I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for your work and your attentiveness to members of both sides of the aisle in the committee and subcommittee on issues that are being discussed today. I would also associate again myself with the remarks from the gentleman of Texas, and to thank both the chair and the ranking member for calling this hearing. I yield back, sir.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Biggs from Arizona.